Hi, I'm Jacqueline Bowl,
And I'm Maggie O'Donnell.
and today we'll be discussing there's a fine line between good and bad, more specifically, good and bad poetry.
But first, before we can distinguish the difference between good poems and bad poems, we're going to look at what exactly a poem is. So, according to dictionary.com, a poem is a composition in verse, especially one that is characterized by a highly developed artistic form and by the use of heightened language and rhythm to express an intensely imaginative interpretation of the subject. So we're going to use some of these later on to describe what makes a poem good and bad. But first, our thesis statement is, in order to distinguish whether an author's poem exemplifies good or bad qualities, one must examine whether the specific elements of poetry are applied in the correct manner. And again, these elements of poetry pertain to either good or bad poems. So the first thing, what not to do. You don't want cliches in your poem. Those are overuses of phrases that loses the overall meaning of work. And according to the University of North Carolina's Writing Center, they are vague, boring, and unoriginal. So let's look at some cliches here. The bottom line, bird's eye view, break a leg, slow as molasses, and happy as a clam. Typical phrases that we have all heard that are just overused and lose the meaning of the overall work. So this is an example I had found on the Coffee Shop Times, which is just an online open forum. And they did a whole section on bad poems specifically pertaining to cliches, so this was an example on here. So it reads, "What is it about you? I can't tell really. Think it's nothing much, actually. Just about everything that you do, the way you smile. Truly I know now, the feeling of my heart melting, the sound of your giggles, truly that be the sound of bliss and joy." So there's a few cliches within here as highlighted. It's nothing much. That's vague and boring, and it really has no depth and concrete images to make you understand exactly what the author is trying to say here. The way you smile, well, there's many ways people can smile. Do you have a pretty smile? Are you glistening? Is it a younger person with braces? Maybe you're into that. And then obviously heart melting, that's as mushy and cliche as it gets. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so our second thing you don't want to do is nonsensical rhyming. This is a quote from our handout, Bad Poems, that Professor Gingrich gave us. "Abandoning all sense for the sake of a rhyme is a sure sign of a versifier who imagines that poetry is a lot of foolish nothings that sound pretty." And that's Steve Noet, and he's a poet and educator. So our first example is old paint. "I paint the door sloppily. I paint the dog, the car. I look for something else. There's the local bar. I paint the stools and beer taps and Hilda's pretty dress. Someone has a problem. Seems I've made a mess." And this was posted by Alan Turner, and it's on his blog, and he just makes kind of bad poems for comical relief, I assume. So as you can see, the highlighted ones, car and bar, there's no real fluency through them. It just goes from one to the next idea. There's no bridge between them. And then this Hilda's dress is just thrown in there. There's real no sense or reason for it. It's pretty bland and takes away from the entire meaning of the poem. And then the third thing is you don't want to confuse your reader. So another quote from Steve, "The author is probably under the misapprehension that poets must not say anything clearly for the fear of having their poetic license revoked." So our first example, this is actually an untitled poem that I found on, it was also an online forum that someone had posted, and the author was not stated. "We have seen thee, queen of cheese, lying quietly at your ease, gently fanned by evening breeze, thy fair form no flies dare seize. All gaily dressed soon you'll go to the great provincial show, to be admired by many of you in the city of Toronto." So this is pretty confusing. Does anyone know what a queen of cheese exactly is? There's no real explanation or reason for it, and while the author tries to be descriptive and seem poetic, it just takes away from the entire meaning, as we can't fully understand what he's saying. And then thy is thrown in there. That's an archaic word, which archaic words pertain to like Shakespearean times or something from previous past times, and it just really takes away from it as we're reading it as if it's present day, and then thy is thrown in there, which gives us, it off balances the poem. And then City of Toronto, there's no other mention of Toronto or cities or any setting really involved, so that's just thrown in there randomly, so we are also confused from this. And Jacqueline will talk about good poems.
Okay. On the opposite side of the spectrum, good poems include imagery, contrast, and voice. Before going more in depth into the characteristics, I think it's important to review what free verse poetry is, because the next three examples are considered free verse. The textbook definition of free verse is the poem's length is determined by the poet according to the needs of the particular poem, according to Burway, page 374. However, what is considered free verse has changed over time. Burway mentions on page 298 that free verse was anything that didn't rhyme, have a pattern, or rhythm. Although that is not true, because free verse should have rhythm and make sense like any good poem. It just doesn't have to have a cookie-cutter pattern made years ago. Continuing on, imagery is the first characteristic of good poetry I will be discussing. According to what makes a poem good, the best poetry often speaks in pictures. Ideas and emotions are given faces, bodies, and actions. A good poem that represents imagery is Sylvia Plath's Stillborn, which reads, "These poems do not live. It's a sad diagnosis. They grew their toes and fingers well enough. Their little foreheads bulged with concentration. If they missed out on walking about like people, it wasn't for any lack of mother love. Oh, I cannot explain what happened to them. They are proper in shape and number and every part. They sit so nicely in the pickling fluid. They smile and smile and smile at me. And still the lungs won't fill, and the heart won't start. They are not pigs, they are not even fish, though they have a piggy and fishy air. It would be better if they were alive, and that's what they were. But they are dead, and their mother's near dead with distraction. And they stupidly stare and do not speak of her." Instead of coming right out and saying she's comparing her poems to a stillborn baby, Plath uses imagery. For example, in line 3, she talks about the development of the baby by saying the forehead's bulged, and in line 8, she writes they sit nicely in pickling fluid instead of using medical terms to create more of an image for the reader. Instead of telling the readers her poems are a disappointment, she makes an image of a mother of a stillborn baby and compares her disappointment to that. According to Agostino of What Makes a Poem Good, contrast creates surprise and is intrinsic to all works of art, which is why contrast is a good characteristic for poetry. One example of contrast in poetry can be seen in the first 3 stanzas of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream, till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. It is clear in the first stanza that Angelou is describing a free bird, which is later compared to a caged bird. More specifically, in line 2, she writes of the wind and floats downstream, and in the 6th line she writes, but a bird stalks down his narrow cage. The diction used in the 2 lines creates the contrast in the piece. The use of float to describe the free bird has a lighter tone than using stalked for the caged bird. By using contrast instead of just stating what the caged bird does, Angelou gives the poem more depth and tension, making it more interesting for the reader. In addition, voice depicts good poetry. Voice has to do with the tone of the poem. A poem's tone can be any emotion, however, should not have a fake poetic voice, which means most poems shouldn't use archaic language and should make sense. An example of the use of good voice can be found in the last 11 lines, 23 through 33, of Young Lee's The Hour and What is Dead. God, that old furnace, keeps talking with his mouth of teeth, a beard stained at feast, and his breath. Of gasoline, airplane, human ash. His love for me feels like fire, feels like doves, feels like river water. And this hour what is dead is helpless, kind and helpless while the Lord lives. Someone tell the Lord to leave me alone. I've had enough of his love that feels like burning and flight, running away. The premise of this poem is the narrator is an insomniac who just wants to go to sleep and have a peaceful night. The way Lee uses multiple commas makes the sentence keep going, which helps shows the narrator's ongoing thoughts. At the end of the poem, the narrator pleads, "Someone tell the Lord to leave me alone." The way Lee uses his voice shows the readers the desperate tone of the poem and how the narrator just wants to be free of his thoughts so he can get a good night's rest. Lastly, according to the poetry chapter in imaginative writing, some additional techniques that can make a good poem are metaphors, repetition, meter, which is the mechanical elements of its rhyme, the number of feet, stresses and unstressed syllables, stress, which is how the word is pronounced, and rhythm, which is the total quality of a line's motion affected by tempo and meter, but also by emotions and sounds. The use of these devices, along with the three above, not automatically make a good poem. They just have a potential when used correctly. In conclusion, there's a fine line between good and bad poetry. However, just because a poem is different from another good poem does not make it bad. Because according to Burway, in A Last Thought, poetry can take shapes that bear little or no resemblance to each other.